Hello, and welcome to the weekly philosophy chat. My name is Claire Foster, and today I'm joined by Dotan Russo.
Good to be here, Claire. Thank you.
Welcome. Good to see you. Today we'll be talking about altruism. So let's jump right in. Dotan, I was thinking that we should start our conversation with a thought experiment, one that our viewers might be familiar with, and that is Peter Singer's drowning child thought experiment. So just to make sure we're speaking the same language here, so the idea is that if there was a child that was drowning in a very shallow body of water, most would not hesitate for even a second to help that child and save its life. And no matter the small cost that it would take, maybe ruining a pair of shoes or being late to a meeting or what have you, most would not hesitate to do that good deed and risk that small cost. Now, if there was a child that was starving in a faraway country and it would require a small amount of money to save this child, most people think of that hypothetical situation and don't actually take action. Yet the cost is minimal and the benefit is truly saving a life. So, why are more people inclined to help that child who is immediately in need versus the child that is not in front of their eyes, but that you know needs the same kind of help? Why are those two not equivalent? There are many angles to this question, so let's dig into a few to start this conversation on altruism.
Okay, I think most of the viewers, maybe all of them, would agree with your assumption that under such circumstances, people will jump into the water to save the child. But this specific example is powerful on one hand because it is illustrating our very basic instinct to help others in times of need when they are under very extreme danger on the one side, and what is required from us is relatively a minor sacrifice. But things are becoming much more complicated when the sacrifice is bigger or the interest involved of the other is lower. And when other factors are getting involved, such as, for example, distance, and so on. And this topic of altruism raises all sorts of questions that I'm sure we'll be exploring here. First of all, what is the origin of altruism? Is it really an act which aim to give someone else something or to sacrifice something from ourselves to help others, or at the end of the day it is actually something that aim to provide ourselves to satisfy a certain need of us? And if that is the case, then maybe it's an egoistic um, mechanism or interest. What does it aim to serve? Is it a moral duty? Or is it just something that we should consider as going beyond, above and beyond, and something that should be praised, but not necessarily a moral duty? How should we balance different interests, our own versus others? And what are the others actually that we are referring to? Who's in this circle? Is it the people who are close to us? Does it also apply to people who are very far from us? So
Mm-hmm.
all those questions are very relevant to the scenario that you were describing when we're zooming out and try to figure out for ourselves what is altruism all about.
Yeah, I do think of altruism as, of course, you're doing something for the benefit of someone else, but I do think there's a component that you are sacrificing something of yourself, whether that's time, money, resources, effort. I think it's not, and perhaps because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Maybe if you are giving to someone, you are then giving up something of yourself just by definition. But I do think about altruism as giving something up of yourself. I do not think of altruism just sort of in general as a concept that is for my own benefit in any way. If I am doing something altruistic, I cannot have a motive that is attached to it, and there cannot be an understood benefit to my actions before I perform the altruistic move. That's how I interpret altruism. But if that is the definition, I do wonder whether altruism is technically possible, because even if you don't receive a specific material benefit, as in the case of saving a drowning child, you also instinctively don't want to be a person that lets a child suffer because you don't want to ruin your shoes or you don't want to be late to your meeting. You don't want to be that kind of person. And in that sense, there is a benefit to you because you don't want to perceive yourself and you don't want others to perceive you as the kind of person that would not help. So I would argue that even in the most extreme case, there is still a benefit. So I do sort of struggle with, is altruism really possible? And but to the point of the example I just used about even getting satisfaction or benefit from the most extreme examples, does that lessen the deed? Does it lessen the deed, to your point earlier, if you do something good for someone else and there is an outcome that benefits you, whether you know about it in advance or not, does that lessen the deed?
Well, if I may push on the premise that you suggested, and that is, you acknowledge that altruism is also driven by self-interest, satisfaction, the sense that we're good, this kind of feeling that we're getting when we are doing something for others. But the crucial question would be here: why shouldn't we assume that this is the true engine, this is the true motive, this is the real driving force for altruism, and not helping the others? It seems like that you made a conclusion, or you suggested that while we get some reward, that is not the dominant interest. But what is it based on? And this is not just a theoretical question because it may have strong implications. For example, we may be able to differentiate between different people in this regard based on the way that they are built. Some people have getting more reward, internal reward, when they're helping others, some less. And that is why some people are more, maybe involved more with altruism, but not because of moral reasons, because they just are getting the incentive they are looking for. So, what is the base to argue that this is actually not the dominant, or maybe even the most, the crucial, or the main, or the only factor that drives people to act this way?
That is hard to say. I want to believe that. I don't know that I can prove that that's true because everyone's agency is different. Everyone's motivations are private. And of course, we take actions for various reasons that we may or may not want to admit. I want to believe that people do act because they genuinely want to help others. I think many will acknowledge that that also has a trickle effect of making them feel good. And I'm wondering if that makes it less of a deed as a result of that. But if I can't prove that the more extreme version of this is not true, that people specifically perform good deeds for the feeling that they get, I don't want to believe that's true. But I can't prove it otherwise. But I hope that it's not true.
I definitely agree with you that there's no way to prove, but maybe there are hints that may suggest the opposite. Think about it. When are more people are more likely to get involved with altruistic acts? When they are getting being acknowledged for it, right? Very few people would donate anonymously, right? When we go to the universities and so on, we see the
Yeah.
buildings with the names of the donators. Very often, these two things will be attached. So people are actually aiming, by the way they act, to the reward which is attached to those acts. People are much more likely to do so when there's no one around, where there's no one to acknowledge it. People are much less likely to help and to provide other people who are very far from them, right? Which may again suggest that the altruism is related to the possible reward from the community, from the surrounding that you are from. People are much less likely to donate, for example, or to sacrifice from themselves for people that do not share the same ideology than they are, the same religion sometimes, right? They're more likely to be supportive of those that they consider to be part of their identity, which may also suggest that it's about the me, the self, or there's a very strong correlation between the two. So while we cannot tell for definitely, there might be good signs to suggest that altruism is actually egoism, which presents itself in a more sophisticated way.
Here's a more positive outlook on the example you just gave about donating, getting your name on some sort of plaque or wall that maybe even within your community, if you were donating to something that benefited your immediate community, that if you felt that by having your name public, people would know that this is something to support and then would perhaps in turn encourage others to do the same. So instead of it sort of ending with the acknowledgement of that one individual, perhaps people will donate to have their names on the wall so that others would see how important it is to give generously to the organization or the cause that you also support.
Although it could just be this building was donated by people who care about the community, uh, maybe you should do the same, right? Without the name of donator, and it may have the same impact. But I
But
agree
does
with you.
it?
This is not solvable, right? And like many other philosophical issues, when we cannot reach a definite answer, we may interpret or we provide a certain explanation based on our psychological tendencies, more optimistic about human nature, more pessimistic, and so on. But if we move forward regarding this, would you argue that altruism is a moral duty, or is it just something that if you are willing to do so, you should be praised, you should be acknowledged, but no one should consider it as a duty, as a moral duty? Where do you stand on this?
As a moral duty, well, so now we're sort of conflating a couple different concepts because I'm not sure we're even aligned on whether altruism is possible. If we're talking about doing good deeds that also give us some benefit, and we're acknowledging that that's an acceptable definition, then yes, I do. I do think that it is our moral duty to perform good deeds and help our community and be an active part of whatever groups that you identify with. I do think that's a moral duty. Again, that is to contribute to and help without expectation of benefit. If there is a benefit in the form of a good feeling or acknowledgement, which I want to talk with you about as well, then I have no problem with that. I have no problem with acknowledgement. I don't think that lessens the deed. I think that the deed, and maybe there are different examples, we could bat them around, but I don't think the deed is necessarily lessened with acknowledgement and the feeling that you have done something good. So I do think it's a moral duty to contribute to the communities of which you are a part. What do
Right.
you think?
And I think what we're touching here is, a big division in philosophy of ethics and
Mm,
morality.
mm,
Where should we put a focus on when we are evaluating a certain act as moral or immoral? Utilitarianism, for example, which is a main theory in
yeah.
philosophy, one of the main theories, suggests that it's all about the outcomes, the consequences. As long as the consequences are good, by the criteria of the greatest happiness to the greatest amount of people, so we are on the moral side, regardless of the motivation. So, based on this, if someone donated money, even if he was doing it only to praise himself and to get the benefit, the social benefit, that doesn't change the fact that the outcome is good because it provided good to many people, and it should be considered as moral. But not everybody agrees on this interpretation of morality.
Mm.
Deontology, for example, Kantian theory argues that morality is all about the motives, and this is how we should value the actions, and the consequences actually have no relevancy to judging the outcome. Now, if we are coming from this approach, then obviously it might be different. So I am wondering if you are the position that you're presenting is basically based on utilitarianist view of morality, that it's all
Well,
about the outcomes.
well,
Motivations are less important.
utilitarianism is performing an action to maximize the benefit for the most amount of people. And
Right.
actually, this is something that I struggle with because there is a line, right? If you want to help the most amount of people, you could arguably donate all of the money that you've saved. And where does that leave you? It leaves you with no money and in a position that you can't participate in your community, you can't give to another cause, perhaps outside your community, and you're left with nothing. So there must be some point, an inflection point, I suppose, where you can maximize the benefit to others while also making sure that you can live a life that you want to live. I'm not even sure that I would say it's a moral requirement that you find that point in your life. Certainly, I don't know if I know many people who do or who have. But I'm definitely curious to know your thoughts about that point after which you are losing your own sense of your own life if you are constantly in service to others, and not just monetarily, with time, with effort, even just with brain space, constantly thinking of others. What does that leave you with? And is your life as important as the ones you are trying to support?
Okay, I think there are two questions here. First is, as we mentioned before, whether altruism should be considered as a moral act, regardless of the motives. And that is the first question. The second question would be a question of quantity, in a sense, right?
Right.
Where do we draw the line? Because there's a constant need from the environment for our contribution, and if we don't put any limit to this, we will be left with nothing, no energy, and no other any other things. So as for the first question, I would actually argue that I think that motives do count. Of course, I acknowledge the consequences, and when something is being done to the benefit of the majority of the people, assuming that the minority are not sacrificed, then it should be considered in a positive way. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's moral. I can think of many acts of, and many people actually, that were doing good things, but the motives were bad, maybe even evil. And I would not consider their actions to be moral. I think I gave this example before in the past about head of our drug cartel who's donating money to a school in some rural place, I don't know, in South America. Should we disconnect the act from the personality, from the person, from his motives? Very often the motives would be evil as well, right? I'm not sure that we can differentiate between the two. I think I tend more to agree that morality, what is unique about morality is that it's about the duty. It's about the principles that you follow no matter what. It's not about the incentives. As for the quantity, how much would be considered enough? Obviously, this is a very practical and crucial question. I think different people draw the line in different places. And I would argue that there's no objective measurement to tell. It also depends on the circumstances, what you are actually facing. But I think we should acknowledge that obviously we are limited in our ability to provide with the needs of others through altruism. Obviously, we're limited. There's much more demand that we can give, and therefore we must choose our battles, and we must also choose the degree of sacrifice that we are willing to endorse. This is where I stand regarding this. And in this context, may I ask you something that we started with, and I think it's very relevant. Um, why is it, or should we consider altruism to be, if we identify it as a moral duty, is it something? Is there any hierarchy there that this moral duty is more relevant to people who are close to us, or distance differences between people serve no factor in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I mean, going back to our original example from Peter Singer, there are a lot of factors there, right? There's a sense of urgency, right? There's a sense of proximity, which is tied to the urgency. There's a sense that you're helping a child that is just sort of innately in need, versus maybe an adult. Is that less compelling? There's, of course, familiarity. So that doesn't apply in that particular situation. But a lot of times, like you said, if we are perhaps more inclined to donate, to give our time to sources with which we are familiar, whether they directly impact us or people we know, or they're in our neighborhood and it feels like you're helping those that are nearby. And so to say that one is more moral than another, I think they all have an impact. I'm not sure that one has more moral weight than another. I think that the variables that impact our sense perceptions are the ones that typically win out, right? So in the case of the child, you see the child right in front of you. Might hear the child. You see that it's a child, not an adult. And you know that the impact that you can make is fast and direct. So also the temporal nature of your assistance, your altruism, I think is another variable. And so I think those the variables that tend to impact our immediate sense perceptions are the ones that I think I'm going to propose might end up feeling more significant and impact our actions more so than perhaps ones that don't impact our direct senses. People we can't see, places we've never been to, and perhaps with a time span that isn't as urgent. So and that's not to say that those factors aren't less moral, but I do think those are the ways that we make decisions.
Okay, and following up on what you said, why is it do you think that people are not acting in a way which will be coherent in a current way in the context of the degree of need? You know, for example, hunger. There are people who suffer from hunger around the world, even today.
Of course.
With relatively a small amount of money, we can make a big change, assuming that
Yeah.
many of us will do so, right? $10 a month, $15 a month, right?
Yeah.
Two Starbucks coffee. And yet, relatively speaking, on a macro scale, very few do so.
Yeah.
How do you explain this? Because it brings the dilemma into a crucial point in the sense that on the one hand, this is the most extreme need. On the other hand, the sacrifice is almost as minor as it can be. And yet, people do not demand from themselves and do not act in altruistic way. How can this be explained? And what may this suggest about us in this context?
Yeah, but
What do you mean?
I think the big difference there is the urgency. I think it's the same phenomenon that you see with, an emergency of some sort comes up and someone says, someone dial 911. Someone dial 911. You're not taking the action to actually find the help because you know that there is time for someone else to help to assist in the emergency. In the case of the child, there is no choice. It's similar to a doctor who is on an airplane and someone has a medical emergency. It's by virtue of your position in that moment, whether it's your job as a doctor to serve someone on an airplane or you're just a passerby who sees a child in need, whatever the case is, theoretical case is. I think the difference in those examples is not that hungry children, that is absolutely an urgent crisis, but it's not in front of you. And it's harder to see, it's harder to understand. And I think our minds want to believe, in the case of someone else call 911, that someone else is also available to help. And so I'm a bit off the hook. And my help, my time, my money, my resources aren't required, as in the case of a drowning child, for example, or someone who's sick on an airplane, where you know that you need to step up and do this right in this moment because you are who you are. So I think that is probably the biggest difference there.
So let's take a different example, which might be a little more close to us: immigration.
Mm.
People immigrate because they want to improve their lives, and some of them are actually coming from horrific life circumstances. It
Yeah,
doesn't need to be a war, right? It can be just, I don't know, there are areas around the world when your child go to school, you cannot be sure that he will be back home, right? Because a
yeah.
gang will shoot him, he might be kidnapped. Of course, if you suffer from a certain cancer or some, even, toothache, there's, you're stuck with it. So these people are in a very strong need. Western countries like US, Canada can provide them with a much better life by sacrificing something, right? Maybe it's a debate. What do we sacrifice to what degree? But let's assume that we do sacrifice. Where do you stand on this? Should we be more generous and let them in, or we shouldn't? And how would you connect this to altruism?
Well, this is a bit of a lightning rod question right now, at least in our country and others as well. It's hard. I mean, this is a tough one to answer, Dotan, and I think it probably also depends on what country you're coming from right now because this is very hard. Um, I can think of so many examples, ones that my family has seen firsthand. Of course, things that you see on the news. I'm always skeptical of reading any one news source. All I know is that there are many people who are here legally who, as you said, want to make a better life for themselves, for their families. And I do think that we should be sacrificing to help our community. This country was founded on that principle that we welcome people. We obviously have to have limits to who we welcome. We cannot welcome everybody. That is not my job in this country to sort out who can come to this country and who cannot. And thank goodness, because it's a terribly difficult and challenging problem to sort. But I will say, as it relates to altruism, we must keep our loving hearts firmly intact when we think about the people who are being impacted by government and others who have claimed that though someone has paid taxes, though someone has had gainful employment, has raised a family, that they are not welcome in our neighborhoods. I I don't support that. I do welcome people who just want to live a good life, as I just want to live a good life, and in that sense, I am willing to, and I have given in those regards. I just actually did some volunteer work, and this is not for credit. I'm just letting you know, for an organization that supports immigrants in my local community. And so why did I do that? Why did I pack up a million bags of food with my friend and participate? Yeah, it made me feel good. That wasn't the primary reason I showed up. There was a big need, and they needed a lot of volunteers, and so I wanted to help. And I knew I didn't meet any of the immigrants that had helped, and that's okay. But I know that it was helping families, with some with a lot of kids, some with no kids, and I felt good about that. And does that diminish the moral nature of my action? I don't think so. But you can disagree if you'd like.
Well, I think the question of immigration touches a very sensitive nerve, and I think you were struggling with the answer for good reasons. I think anyone who would be truthful and would aim to be honest will struggle with this question because it actually brings down to earth the philosophical question about altruism and the sub questions that we're discussing here. Is it a moral duty? To what degree we should be willing to sacrifice? Do we have any moral duty to others? Who are those others that we have moral duty to? Is it anyone? Even someone from Africa, from Middle East, wherever that would be, and so on. And I think that, as I mentioned, it's a very sensitive nerve. And first of all, it can be very often when we are asking philosophical questions in general and morality, even more so, we are referring, there's some intellectual aspect to it, and there's also psychological, emotional aspect to
Mm-hmm.
it, and different people react differently. And sometimes it's very useful to ask those questions because once we reflect on them, we can identify where we actually stand philosophically,
Yeah.
right? By just answering this question about immigration, to what degree you're willing to sacrifice. It also helps us acknowledge why people see it differently, because people, at the end of the day, they may not use philosophical terms, they may not even, articulate themselves in an intellectual way, but people have their own life philosophy regarding different things. We all have. And if they have, and people may tend to be, let's say, against immigration or in favor of immigration, very much based on their internal intuitive understanding of what altruism is and to what degree they are actually committed to it. I think that practically speaking, the differences are not that huge because we would all agree that immigration, yes, there are people in need and we should be willing to sacrifice to help them. And I think on this very basic formula, most people would agree. But the question here would be the degree, just as we mentioned. And we would also all agree, I think, that there should be a limit to this. So we all agree that it's also a matter of degree, and the exact degree depends on so many factors, and
Yeah.
we are not even familiar with the data and so on. And I think what this shows is that at the bottom line, although sometimes it seems to be that there are major differences between us, in fact, the differences are not that big when we actually try to identify our true philosophical principles and moral principles regarding this. Most people on both sides would agree that, yes, some people should be let in. Of course, there should be a limit to it. Now let's discuss the limits. And
Yeah.
I think overall, from a philosophical perspective, it obviously illustrates that altruism is something that definitely has limits, and it should also have limits because we are not willing to sacrifice everything or not even a lot. Practically speaking, every time that you go to Starbucks and you buy yourself a coffee, obviously there's a better use for this money. You can give it to a homeless. Maybe it would be his one and only hot meal. And yet, Starbucks is full, and hardly anyone, expect this from themselves. So I wonder, in this context,
Well,
I wonder, maybe also we should acknowledge that there's a lot of pretenderness and hypocrisy regarding this concept of altruism because we are very selective regarding this. We are very picky in terms of when and what and whom. And at the end of the day, most of us are put, in terms of quantities, we put the line very, very close to us.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I
so
think we
maybe
do live in a capitalist society, right? So people make their money and they want to keep it. We don't live in a communist society. We don't live in a socialist society. Well, it's a topic for another conversation where we need to share everything. This is not what the United States is. And so I think there isn't a culture that you give everything that you get. You come here, you earn a living, you make money, you keep it. And so I don't think the culture that children are even brought up with, I think it is philanthropic to some extent, but I don't think there's even a culture of giving as much as you can. I think in some communities, I think that's true. I think certainly there's some religious communities that do probably practice that a bit more.
that the
But
reward will be bigger. This might explain it when you
well,
donate
absolutely.
inside a
That's a very good
community.
point.
Yes,
Absolutely. Yes. Well, inside a community and particularly a religious community, because
yes,
if you're doing good deeds, maybe that's a fast track to redemption, heaven, whatever you believe in. And that
yes.
is meaningful to those people. It's not what I personally subscribe to. That's not why I would do something, but that means a lot to so many people. And I don't discount that. I'm also curious to know what you think about our moral duty versus the group's moral duty. Is there something there in terms of companies or communities as a whole versus individuals? Does the moral duty change from an individual's capability to assist versus a business's capability versus a community to help itself? Is one more important than another?
Well, I would suggest the possibility that altruism is overrated. In the sense that there's what seems to be altruism very, very often, in most cases, maybe even regarding most people, is aimed to serve something different. It is origin from different motives, selfish ones, and therefore we use this term in a way which doesn't necessarily fit. The true description of this of what is actually going on, and if that is the case, then altruism is not necessarily a moral concept. It is more a practical social concept, which is aims, to improve societies. Just like there are so many other aspects in societies that are aiming for the same thing, right? Law, for example, law doesn't aim to, unlike the way many people think, it doesn't aim to provide with justice. It aims to serve the society, right? To bring order and to get to the greatest happiness, the greatest amount of people in a way. And although, of course, there are limitations to this. So, and if that is the case, then maybe we should drop out the idea or the connection between altruism and morality, and consider altruism again as something that is useful to the society. And if that is the case, of course, we should expect more from those who are capable to give more, not because we trust or we think that they are moral agents or their motives are moral, but because they can do that. And if the expectations will be higher, the demand will be higher, they would just, react in accordance because they want the reward, they want their incentives. And companies have are much more invested in this, and they are much more capable. So I would argue, yes, companies, organizations should provide much more than individuals. They should be met with much higher expectations and maybe even accountability if they don't do so. But I would not look at it from the moral angle. I think
Hmm.
that we're not doing justice and we're not being truthful in many, many cases when we consider those acts to be moral. This is not the case. I see now the social media is full of. I'm moving to a completely different example with Free Palestine. So you
Hmm.
can see like a 30 seconds video on TikTok. A woman, she stands in the camera, she doesn't say anything with the Free Palestine in the back, and you can obviously tell that in many cases, not all, but in many cases, the purpose of this is to get attention, to get attraction, and it's about her, not about the Free Palestine. So it on a first glance, it would seem like a altruistic act, right? She's actually, she's advocating for something she believes in. Well, in fact, many are jumping on this because it's a trend and it's rewarding. And
Hmm.
regardless if it's right or wrong, I'm not even getting into it. But should we consider it as an altruist act when actually the thing itself, which seemed to be altruistic, is being used for pure selfish, self-rewarding interests.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty, that's an example I think we can agree is pretty clear cut. But what about just going to do volunteer work? If why would one go do volunteer work if there wasn't a moral component to it?
Oh,
That it
so
wasn't the
many
right thing
reasons,
to
so many
do?
incentives. If you're retired, it's a way for you to get social interactions, to be involved, to get out
Right,
of the
go
house.
to Starbucks. You spend your $5 at
Yeah,
Starbucks.
but then you're going to sit by yourself when you're, I don't know, if you're working, you are volunteering in a certain organization, I don't know, a sport club, then you get to
Mm,
see people, you get to interact. So there are social incentives. People see you. Usually it's something that happens in the community. So there again, there's this reward because people would notice that you're volunteering. Sometimes obviously people volunteer in Canada, for example. It's very common to volunteer because it's a social expectation. If you need to even to be accepted, if you want to be accepted to medical school, if you can show that you were volunteering before, your chances are much higher. And this is
mm.
true about many other aspects. So, what is it? Is it really volunteering, or is it just that you know that you want to be accepted to medical school, and this is what is required? So you're volunteering,
Because the
right?
schools want moral doctors. They want to accept people who are going to
Yeah,
be
but
moral
maybe,
doctors. No,
but you see
I
the
know I understand
absurdity
that's
here,
not
right? Because
yes,
it's
yes, it's
an
not a pure
expectation.
instinct.
Without it, you
Yes.
cannot get into the medical school. People would do it to get to the medical school, and the medical
And
school
then
would
stop.
consider it as a moral sign, the signs
I
for them
know, I
being
know,
moral.
I
And
know.
that is exactly, I think, this is a very good illustration why it is important to identify for ourselves what is altruism all about in truth.
Yeah.
Sometimes it will have practical implications. Now, I'm not suggesting that there is no such thing as altruism. Of course, there is. What I'm suggesting is that when we look at it as a general, phenomena in a big context on a macro level, we should be much more skeptical, suspicious. We should question. We should be willing to question what are the true motives. What is it aimed to serve, and acknowledge that very often it's not about morality. It's about other things,
Mm.
and this is how it should be seen.
Wait, do you think there is? So you think there is an example of pure altruism?
I think, you said this before, and I agreed with you that there's no possible way to prove this because we cannot know. I'll give you the most radical example that seems to be shielded from any criticism, right? What about, let's say, a soldier who run into the fire to save his friends, knowing that he will
Yeah,
sacrifice his life, right?
yeah, yeah,
He's doing the ultimate sacrifice. What kind of reward can possibly be there, right? He's
yeah,
going to die to save his friends. So, on a first glance, it may appear, it seems as if this is at least this can serve as an evidence that there is some spectrum where we can act from altruism. But when you dig into it, even this is not shield because why is it that the soldier is running into the fire?
yeah. He didn't want to, maybe he made the split-second decision that to live knowing that he didn't do everything he could to save his comrade is not a life that he could possibly live, and it was worth dying over. I mean, that
That's a
could
possible
be.
answer, right? The blame to avoid the blame. He's part of a social expectations in a certain a mindset,
Yeah,
right?
sure.
That
Bravery,
that
absolutely.
bravery, right, and heroism,
Yeah.
and willing to sacrifice, and all those are internal incentives. It's true
Yes.
that when we observe it from the outside, we'd say yes, but in 1 hour we'll be dead. There will be no one to enjoy this, let's say,
Right.
right? But he's making the decision while he's still alive and under the
Yes.
same this wire, right? The mind.
Yes. Yes. Hmm.
And this is probably one of the most extreme examples that we can
Yeah.
think of in this regard. So it's
Hmm.
extremely, it's philosophy because in principle it's unsolvable.
Right.
Otherwise, it would be maybe a scientific question.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Well, thank you so much. This was a great conversation on altruism or whatever it is. Hopefully, we'll hear from some folks about what they think altruism is and what it's not. And on that note, thank you for joining, and we'll see
Thank you,
you
Claire.
next
It was
week.
great. Great to be here. Thank you.